Hi, I'm Carmen Geddes and welcome to 10 Sisters TV. Today we are going to do this fun patchwork bow. So bows are all the rage apparently and are coming back, but patchwork bows are just that added touch. They're just going to make such a fun way to decorate so many things. Wouldn't this be cute? At the bottom of a wreath or hanging it on the top of your tree for a topper is really popular. All sorts of fun ways we can do this. So, of course, we're going to show you how to do this bow on our EasyPiecing grid. And so if you're new to EasyPiecing grid, there is a link right below that's going to take you to my website, which is 10sisters.com. And we have lots of tutorials and lots of great information. But basically, this is a fusible foundation that we have printed a grid on. So this is just a really fun way to do all sorts of piecing. And it's really fun and it's really easy. So the EasyPiecing grid we're working on today is our border panels. Now our border panels are these narrow panels that are 36 squares long. We print these in 3 different sizes. They're labeled by the finished size of the square. So the one that we're using for today's project is our 2-inch finished. So that means we are using 2.5-inch cut squares. So this is great. So pre-cuts like the jelly rolls and layer cakes and even the 2.5 little mini charms are all going to cut easily into the 2.5-inch squares. So our project for a bow this size, so you can see this is how big the bow is going to be 36 squares long. So we're using our border panel that is the 2-inch finished, and that panel has 4 squares across. And so we're going to talk about how an easy way to make this 6 squares across, because our finished bow is finishing, you can see here, it's finishing with 3 squares across, but it's on both sides. And so we need 36 squares by 6 squares in our final piece that's going to turn into this cute bow. So the main thing is you're going to have the fusible side up, and then you're going to just take your scrappy squares. This is so fun. I've got a little Valentine's fabrics in here and some Christmas fabrics. And of course, I'm just going very scrappy. We're laying our squares right on top of this grid, and then we are going to iron them, and that's going to fuse them in place. Now, a couple tips about fusing our squares down. Some people, if you don't have a small iron or if you are in a smaller space, sometimes it's nice to use a washable glue stick. So this is a starch-based product. You want to make sure that this is not like a permanent glue, but this is a washable school glue. And I'm not trying to glue the whole square down. I'm just putting, now this is clear or white, so you can't see, but promise I am putting some glue down here. And so we're just putting a little bit so that basically this is going to hold this square in place while we get all of our squares placed. It's just going to hold it in place until then I can pick this up and take it over to the iron to press. And so, and then we're going to just give this a good 2, 3, 4 seconds. If you have an iron that's got steam, I love to add some steam to this. We'll talk about more steam. The other option that a lot of quilters like is an applique pressing sheet. This is a silicone sheet that you can lay over the top, and then it's not going to, you're not going to have to worry about any of this fusible, okay? Because that's the most important part about this whole project is we want to have the fusible side up. You're only going to try to iron this to your ironing board one time, so you always make sure that bumpy side is up. Now, if you're a glider, if you like to glide with your iron and do more ironing, then applique pressing sheet is good for you. If you're more of just holding and pressing, then you don't need to do an applique pressing sheet, but you want to be very aware what is still fusible. And so If there are some little spaces in between your squares, don't worry about that. Even if you put your iron straight down on that, the fabric is here and the foundation is under it. So even on some of these little gaps, it's not going to get on your iron, but anything around the outside will. So some good options for fusing. Now this panel is 4 squares across, but I want my bow to be 6 squares across. So what I'm going to do is I am taking another one of our panels, and I want you to notice a couple things. Let me move this a little closer towards me so you can see it a little bit better. So what we're doing is I've got the second panel here, and notice on one side of this panel I've got this little extra, I call it a little extra lip, just a little extra of the fusible foundation that is beyond that printed square. And then notice on this side I trimmed my panel right on the dotted line or right next to the fabric. And so then what I'm going to do, and sometimes I will do this after I've ironed all the squares down, so we could place squares. I need 2 more squares, so I could add all the fabrics on 2 more squares and then do this next step. But I'm just going to show you what I do to fuse these two. The concept of what we're doing, sometimes these lids take a little bit of strength. The concept of what we're doing is we are basically cutting and pasting the foundation to be whatever size you want your project to be. And so we do this with small projects and with big quilts. Okay, so now I've added a little bit of glue stick along that little extra lip, and I'm going to line this up, not with the fabric, but I'm lining up the little dotted lines. Might be a little hard for you to see, so you just got to trust me, but I'm lining it up with the foundation. And then the glue is going to hold it in place. Now typically, like I said, I do like to have squares on the other side, because what that's going to do is, I'll show you here. Let's just lay a few down. So if I go ahead and place a few of these squares down on the other side, then when I go to heat set this in place, make sure those are centered in that printed square, then I'm not only pressing the squares down on the other side, but I'm fusing these 2 panels together. And again, you know, if you have a little bit of steam, now if you don't have a good steam iron, or you don't like to put water in your iron, a little mist bottle is going to do the same thing. That's going to just generate some steam. But notice I'm kind of holding this for a good, this is when we practice our deep breathing, you know, 2, 3, 4. We're going to just make sure these are nice and fused in place. And so then I will add this next row. Let me move it back up this way so you can see. So I'll add the next row of squares, and then I'll trim that off. And so now I will be piecing a section that is 6 squares across by 36 squares long, which I happen to have one right here. Let me move this out of the way. So this is my pieced. Isn't this amazing? It looks pretty big, but remember that we're going to be sewing all the seams, and then we're going to be folding it in half. I just kind of want to show you. I've got this nice long piece all ironed down, very scrappy. We've got 6 squares across, and it's 36 squares long. And so now when you are ready to sew, I'm going to show you on this side. We're just going to, I've already sewn a few, but we are going to, whoops, wrong side. We're going to just fold right sides together, right on that dotted line, and then just sew your 1/4 inch seam right here. And then you just fold it on the next one, fold that right on that fold line, sew your 1/4 inch seam. I do like to do a little back stitch at the beginning and the end, and you're gonna sew that seam, those 1/4 inch seams, through the whole panel. And it's gonna do a couple things. It's going to sew these together, obviously, but it's also gonna shrink this up a little bit because of seam allowances. And so then this is what it's going to look like after we've sewn all these short seams across the whole section. And now we are going to, our next step is, let me fold it this way so you can see a little bit better. Let's do this first one. Okay, so now this is that seam that you just sewed. Let's bring it in here. So here's that seam that you just sewed, and notice, I can see here, do you see the little lip right here? This is where I fused. Here's my 4 squares, and then here's my 2 extra. And so this is the seam that you just sewed, and you are going to snip right between each of those squares right up to the stitch line. And the nice thing is when you have that, before you snip those, you can actually just kind of see the little dotted line, plus you can see that space in between the squares. Now the reason that you're doing that clipping, so you're going to clip through every single row, and the reason why we're doing that clipping is so that you can press your seam allowances going in opposite directions. And this is where I really recommend that you bring in the steam. The steam is going to do 2 things. The steam is going to really help just flatten out these seams, kind of does a lot of the work for you. What I like to do is I do some steam, and then I just kind of hold that and set it. And then I'm going to fold this under, and then I'm going to go back the other direction. Again, just steaming and setting. Now, like I said, the steam does 2 things. It really helps do a lot of the work for you in pressing these seam allowances. But the other thing that it does is it keeps this foundation nice and soft. So it really, whether it's our patchwork bow or whether it's a complete quilt top, it's going to really make it a really nice, manageable project. So after you have sewn all your seams, done your clipping and pressing, see how those seam allowances are all going opposite directions. Now it's time to fold right sides together to sew the other way. And I want you to look what happens. All of these seams are perfectly nested. So there's no pinning, there's no adjusting. You're going to just sew your seams the other direction all the way through that whole nice section. And they are going to match up perfectly every single time. Let me show you how it turns out. So here's my section that is all sewn up. It did shrink up quite a bit, as you can see. But do you see how each of those intersections are just perfect every single time? The other thing that I think is so fun is look at how scrappy you're able to go. Now the other pressing thing that I want to show you is after you've sewn all your long seams, and basically you're just going to press all these seams in one direction. Now because this is your completed quilt top, because this, is our completed section that we're sewing, it doesn't really matter which way you're pressing this. Like if one of them wants to go one way, one of them wants to go another way, then just you can press them whichever way you want. So what I like to do when I'm pressing the second seam, because it is a little bit more bulky, I like doing steam and mist bottle. These mist bottles are the best invention. So I like to do the mist, which is going to give it a little extra steam, and then I like to hit the steam on my iron. The other thing that's important in the pressing, both sewing the one direction and the other, is after you sew on the back, you want to turn it over and press it nice and flat from the top. Now sometimes it's easy to get little folds, in these where the seams don't actually open up nice and flat. So I like to make sure that happens. Okay, so now we've got our whole big long bow section all done, and we're just going to fold this in half because our bow is 3 squares across and 36 down, and it is really long. Let me throw it out that way. So now our next thing is we want to create this cute little end. So it's like a little swaggy looking little end of our bow. And so what's nice is I can kind of look at my squares, and it gives me a really good eyeball of where I want to put these. Now on this, what I like to do, what I decided I wanted is to come up to about halfway, but in this second square here from the bottom. I want that point to come up about halfway. Now notice my 1/4 inch is sewn on this side, and it's not on this side. So you can actually just draw this or eyeball it. I'm going to just say, okay, here's where my 1/4 inch seam would be. And then here's a 1/4 inch away from the end. That's where I want my bottom points to be is here, not clear at the bottom. So I'm going to start 1/4 of an inch up. I've already marked a little spot that's about halfway through that second square, and just mark that. And then I've got here my marking that's about 1/4 of an inch from the side and the bottom, and then just mark this. Now I'm going to mark this on both sides, and then we are going to sew 1/4 of an inch around and go all the way to the other end, but somewhere in the middle of this, doesn't have to be exact, but somewhere in the middle, I just mark so that I can remember, is I'm going to leave about a 6 to 8 inch opening, and it's easier if it's somewhere in the middle. Because this is very long, one little tip that might make opening, or might make turning this inside out a little bit easier, is actually do an opening a little bit closer to this end, and then way down here at the other side, do the same thing. Just make another opening that's a little closer to that end. So then you have two sections that you do not sew, but what that's going to do is give you a lot less bulk to turn inside and out, and then we'll just close up 2 seams. So I'm going to pause, and I'm going to go do this sewing, and then we'll come back and turn this and finish up our cute bow. Hi, okay, we are back from the sewing part, and there's a couple things that I want to, a couple little tips I want to give you about how to get really good points, or to help you get good points, especially on patchwork, something that we piece together. And I'll put this here so you can kind of see. So typically we think, okay, this is that seam that was already sewn in our 6 squares across panel, and then, you know, we're coming up and going to this point and then coming down. And so what I want to show you that we're doing is, instead of coming straight down to a point and then just sinking your needle, pivoting and sewing the other direction, there's a little tack that we can take. So instead of sewing down to the point, pivoting and straight back up, you are going to come down and then take one stitch forward. And you probably can't see this, but what I did is I took 1 stitch, and I just kind of carefully, if you need to do it with a hand wheel, but I reversed. So I went forward, back, forward, you know, just as a little reinforced tack. And so you're going to come straight down and then pivot and go 1 stitch over, reinforce that if you want, and then come up to this point. And then I've done the same thing here. I've come up to that point and I pivoted and I did 1 stitch across, and then go back down, and then I stopped here, and then I pivoted and did 1 stitch across to that seam that was already sewn. The other thing I want to show you is I did do an opening close to each end. I did one on this side and one on the other side. The other little tip I've got, especially if you're piecing on this patchwork for a bow, is don't stop in the middle of a seam or of a seam allowance. You want to have your, when you're stopping for your opening, do it somewhere on a plain square so that you're not trying to turn that inside out and trying to turn it at a seam allowance. It's just going to be easier and a lot less bulky. So the next step that we want to do is trimming this corner, these points, so that they will turn nicely. And so I'm actually going to cut that, not 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to cut that pretty close to about 1/8 of an inch from that point. And this is another reason why it might be nice to do a forward, back, forward to reinforce that point. Then I'm going to trim this side seam allowance just close to the point. I'm just going to trim it a little bit closer, and then same here, just a little closer to that point. I'm kind of going at an angle so I can come back out to my 1/8 of an inch, and so that makes sense. So another thing you may consider as you are sewing this area right here is to shorten your stitch length just a little bit. You know, if you're sewing all of these seams at like a 2.5 stitch length, maybe tighten this up to a 2.0 just because we're going to have a smaller seam allowance here. So then keep that at 1/4 of an inch. We're going to cut through, come up to where this point is. And let's just do the other side. I'm going to kind of shave this seam allowance a little bit here. I'm going to do a little bit here. And then keep that at about that 1/4 inch. We're going to come up to this point, and instead of making this seam allowance smaller, got a little thread, instead of making this seam allowance smaller, we're going to do a clip right up to very close, really close to that little tack that you took. Now if you want, you could just shave down a little bit of the bulk of that seam allowance, you know, just right here, but just be very careful not to cut through any sewn seams. So if that makes sense, we're going to turn that inside out, and then I did the same thing on the other side. And so I'm going to trim this exactly the same way on this other side, but I'm going to show you how I like to turn this inside out. And I do this if I'm turning a pillow inside out or a pin cushion. Anytime I'm turning something inside out, I gather this up, and what I want to try to do is to get that point. In fact, on this one, both points, I want both these points to be out of the hole first, rather than trying to turn it inside out right from here. I reach in. This is why it's nice to have 2 openings. Makes this so much easier to turn this inside out. So I try to poke that point out as best I can. Let's get this other side, and I'm going to poke that point out. So I'm pulling the ends out first, if that makes sense. So I'm pulling the ends out first, and then while I still have got this nice little opening, I've got this nice little pointer tool. There's lots of different ones you can get. What I would not use when I'm doing this is I would not use scissors. Ask me why I'm giving you this advice. I wouldn't use scissors or a knitting needle. I have used like a long, narrow cuticle stick that's kind of a point, maybe a chopstick would work. But if you spend a few dollars and get a nice little point turner, and you want to be very careful, this is another reason why it's nice to tighten your stitch length up here. And then I've got one other little trick that sometimes helps. I just grab this at 2 sides of a point, and I just kind of do this little wiggly thing. I just kind of like manhandle that, and it just seems to kind of help work that point out a little bit. But see how nice, even this one up here, it turned inside out so nicely. You don't have to do any kind of managing with that. But because you did that little clip, it really helps that lay nice and flat. And then we're going to do the pressing on these. You know, this is a little bit more bulky where you've got seam allowance, so sometimes work this through with your fingers. I have another little thing I like to do when I have turned something inside out, and then you've got that seam, and sometimes it's just really hard to get that to lay flat. I don't know why, but licking the fingers seems to help. I lick my fingers, and then I just roll this edge. And this is the one where we just sewed that seam. You know, the other one, I already was all pressed flat to begin with, so it lays really nicely. But the one that I just sewed, rather than just trying to take an iron to it and pressing it, because it just sometimes doesn't want to turn inside out, the trick is licking your fingers, and then you just roll that edge, and it kind of softens it up, helps that to lay nice and flat. And then again, you know, really like to give that some steam rather than pressing hard with the iron. You're going to let that steam do a lot of this work. And we're going to turn this whole thing inside out. But see what a cute, nice finished edge, and look at all that fun patchwork, all this different patchwork. So you can definitely turn it over, press it from both sides. All right, I'm going to finish turning this inside out, and then we'll get to the end. right, now I've got this all turned inside out. That went pretty slick. Licking my fingers. Now the other thing you can do is, this is the seam that we sewed shut. And so I can fold this so that that seam is exposed here. Probably easier than licking your fingers, especially on this nice big long. So I'm just gonna come down. See, that's that seam. Now this is our opening, one of our openings. So I've got two, one on each end. And so what I'm gonna do when I'm right here is we're gonna be closing this up. So I wanna show you how we're gonna do that. So I would like to, this is another reason why it's nice to have that opening stop in a nice middle of the square instead of on the seam allowance, is because I'm gonna come and fold this in at 1/4 of an inch on either side. Give that a little press, a little steam. It's gonna help keep that nice and pressed. And then I'm gonna do the other side, fold that in at 1/4 of an inch. You know, whatever seam allowance you used to sew this shut, that's the seam allowance you want to use to close this. Do each of these. And then we've got these seam allowances. Now let's get it go this way. So you can see how this is going to take a little bit of pressing, but this is our little opening here. And I'm going to take my glue stick, get that lid off. And then I'm going to put a little bit of glue stick on that folded over seam allowance on the one side. Remember, this is starch based, so it's kind of like we're just over starching our fabric, and it happens to help it to stay together. So I've got that opening folded on both sides. We're going to match up our squares and just press these two together. And then I'm just going to heat set that with a nice little hot iron. Make sure to hit it with some steam if you want, just for good measure. Now this whole thing is going to take some good pressing to get it, and some steam to get that nice and flat. Here's our other end, that other cute little end, some steam and some pressing. So we're going to do that on the whole thing. So now this is my other opening here. So I'm going to do the same thing to close up this end. And then I'll take this over to the sewing machine. And I probably want to make sure I'm using the red thread, but I'm just going to do a little stitch to close up this. Of course, you could do this by hand if you want to, but you're just going to close up that opening. Sew that opening shut, and now you've got your cute, nice big long bow. Now this is where kind of some creativity comes into play, where you can just start playing with and tying this up into your bow. And I will tell you, this takes a little bit of jiggling around, takes a little bit of work to just get things, you know, to where you want them, but you're basically going to just tie this bow. I will do another quick little variation on another video to show that if you want to use this just for your two bow pieces and sew it, and then we'll do a separate little middle section of the bow. But I kind of like having this big long piece, because what's fun about this is you could use this for a cute little swag on a fireplace or over the top of a door. This would actually be a cute little thin table runner. You know, sometimes I love to have table runners on the table, but when they're too wide, you're like, I don't want to put dishes of food on top of this cute table runner, or especially if you have a little centerpiece. So I think this would actually make a very cute table runner too, that would be a nice little narrow runner in the middle of the table. So I kind of like the fact that we're leaving this all as one piece, but I hope that this gives you some fun ideas for the holidays or just decorating in general. And that's this size of cute bow using our EasyPiecing Border Panels. Now, I do want to say one little note. If you want this border or this bow or this piece to be bigger, if you want it wider, you're going to follow the same fusing techniques that I showed you at the beginning to add more panel to make it longer, or add more panel to make it more squares across. So the sky's the limit. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'd love for you to like and subscribe. Really helps to get the word out about all of our tutorials. Check out all the rest of our tutorials on tensisters.com. That is where you will find EasyPiecing Grid that you can order. And also on tensisters.com, we have a locator map that lets you click on that to put your zip code in, and it will let you know quilt shops that are close to you that carry EasyPiecing Grid. So thanks so much for watching our fun patchwork bow tutorial, and we'll see you next time.